Good day. Thank you for joining BlackBerry. We appreciate you being with us. Our webinar today is the Digital Hijacking at Sea, Unveiling a Cyber Attack Scenario in the Red Sea. Before I hand the mic over to our speakers, let's walk through a few housekeeping items. Attendees are in listen mode only. The webinar recording will be sent to you automatically. We encourage you to share it with your team. On your webinar console, the related content window includes resources for today's session. Anytime during the webinar, submit your questions in the Q&A window. We have reserved the last segment of our time today to respond to your questions. If we run out of time, we will follow up with you after the session. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Ismail Valenzuela, Dr. Rory Hopcroft, and Corey Ransom. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Felicia. We appreciate the introduction. Just wanted to say thank you to everybody that we have attending from around the world today. We're going to be walking through a very unique scenario that Dr. Hopcroft and his team at Plymouth University have put together on the digital hijacking of a ship. This is a simulation, but it's very interesting to see the elements of how this comes together. We're also going to be talking about some of the threats in general from a cyber perspective that Ishmael and his team at BlackBerry have put together, have a little bit of a discussion on how that relates to the maritime industry, and then, as Felicia said, have a whole section for question and answers. So make sure if you have questions throughout the presentation that you drop those into the Q&A session. We want this to be an engaging discussion. So again, if you do have questions, please make sure you drop those in. Although in the seminar today, we're looking at a simulation that involves a cargo ship, you could realistically insert a cruise ship or a large yacht into this simulation. So just to give you that kind of context. So I want to turn it over to Rory to be able to go through the simulation that they put together. Rory?
Thank you very much, Corey. So, if you don't know, at University of Plymouth, we have what we call Cyber Ship Lab, which is a research facility where we have a whole host of physical maritime devices, from super yachts all the way up through to ultra-large container vessels. Within the lab, we can create various ships networks that we can then run tests against to understand their vulnerabilities, not just in single systems, but also within the broader system of systems. So the scenario I'm going to show you now, we put together a couple of years ago. And I will warn you, it's quite a dramatic scenario, and it is one that we know to be technically possible. We have found the vulnerabilities in the systems that we're going to talk about today, and we've actually implemented this attack within our lab to see what this looks like. Throughout, you will see I have one long video that I'll show that's about 2.5 minutes long. It's a real-time video. It's a mixture of 3D modeling as well as some simulator footage with some crew in the ship's bridge. I do apologize for the terrible acting. I am not an actor, but we have run this very scenario through with numerous crews to see what their responses are, and that's what we're trying to show here. I will also say we have removed the tugs from the visuals just because it clutters the image slightly. But when we run through this, all these scenarios are designed with our master mariners here at Plymouth, alongside our experts in the lab. So while these are technically operationally correct, realistic, we have just simplified some of the visuals just to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to start the first animation. As I say, this is a real-time video feed. Hopefully it will start. There we go. So this is real-time video of the scenario as it plays out. So from start to finish, it's about 2.5 minutes. So not a very long length of time. So what we have is an ultra-large container vessel entering basically the Kill Van Cole channels on its way into New York. These vessels call in there semi-regularly at the moment, and I know with New York's plan for 2050 that they're dredging deeper, raising the bridge at the end to get these vessels in a little bit more common. But the kill van coal itself is only about 300, 350 meters wide at points. You can see the skull and crossbones flashing there. Now, if attackers projected where they were going to trigger attacks, that would make life a lot easier. Unfortunately, they don't. For us, that'll signify GPS coordinates, which I'll pick back up on in a moment. When the vessel hits those GPS coordinates, something happens, which happens to be the engines go full ahead, the rudder goes hard over. This is not something the crew have initiated. Obviously, we have physical devices on the bridge, like the rudder angle sensor. Obviously, this shows that there has been some change in the rudder state. That's assuming the crew spot this straight away. There may be a delay before they do. And also potentially be an alarm on the bridge as well to signify something wrong with the rudder. At this point, they notice something wrong. About 30, 40 seconds potentially here of discussion before they realise, and that's when the bow has started to turn. So there is some corrective measures trying to be taken, both engine and rudder. Neither of these have any response. So in other words, the crew, none of their commands are getting through to the engine room. They're effectively locked out on the bridge. At this point, Master would ring the engine room, find out what's going on. Again, there'd be a conversation there. Nothing would be working down in the engine room. At this point, the emergency stop procedures would come into effect. Obviously, vessel this size isn't going to stop particularly quickly. It's not going particularly fast, but as you say, they don't stop quickly. And as I say, the vessel basically now drifts off course and runs aground. It's 2.5 minutes, as said, between the initial trigger point at those GPS coordinates at the entrance of Kilvan Cole and the initial grounding. Because of the momentum and size of that vessel, it would also mean that the stern swings round as well. Sort of soft, muddy banks on either side of the channel there means that gets dug in quite spectacularly. Obviously, those of you that know New York, that isn't a good position to be in. 95% of all traffic going into New York and New Jersey have to go along Kilvan Cole. So obviously, we've now got a ship stuck across the channel. But what actually happened? I mean, that could be an engine fault, rudder failure. That could be any numerous things. But obviously, in line with the talk and the work that we do at the lab, it's a cyber attack. Again, very basic demonstration here of what actually happens. Obviously, the vessel is listening to a lot of sensors, both internally, externally, one of those being GPS. That's fed in alongside the commands from the helm into the central network of the vessel, into command packets, sent through to the engine room, and obviously that creates the physical movement of the rudder and the propeller. But what happened? In this particular instance, the crew received an email from their onshore support team saying, look, you need to do a chart update. Relatively common, happens pretty commonly. Downloads it to the master's computer, puts it on a USB stick, walks across the ship's bridge, plugs it into ECDIS and updates it. Doesn't have to get onto the ECDIS in this way. This was just a particular way we spoke about it. We've spoken with others, and $1,000 is all it takes to bribe some people to take things onto a ship, which obviously isn't a good place to be. I'm going to see if I can restart that video as we go. Next slide. There we go. So it'll just play back through again. So obviously now they've gone to this website, downloaded this the chart update. But obviously, unbeknownst to them, they've gone to a malicious website. Alongside the chart update, they've also downloaded a second piece of information. The second piece of software sits on the network looking for GPS coordinates. Obviously, ECDIS sees GPS traffic all the time, looks for those coordinates that correspond with Kilvan Cole entrance, and when it recognises it, it triggers. And what that second piece of software does is it just floods the network with command packets of our doing that say, hard over, full ahead. The problem with vessels at the moment is that there is no real way of determining whether it's a legitimate or illegitimate packet. As long as it's within operation tolerances, it's not normally a problem. The rudder, the engine will just do that manually. And that's where we have some form of problem. And I say we targeted ECDIS. It happened to be a phishing email with a member of crew on board. Doesn't have to be. We've seen lots of different attack vectors that we've tested out in the lab. From engineers taking on devices themselves doing software firmware updates, to pilots plugging in their own devices, to e-cigarettes being plugged in on the ship's bridge. Software, malicious software will get on the ship at some point in time. In the lab, we've broken every piece of kit that we've got. Most pieces of kit have taken less than a day, but every piece we have broken, some of those took us less than a minute to get them to boot to our own operating system. So there is a real problem. We've also, as part of what we do in the lab, is we buy older systems, second-hand systems, as well as brand new systems. And every piece of system that we found that's an older piece, we found malware on board. It's not doing anything, because it's not designed to target those particular systems, but it's on board, which means it is getting there. And all it does take is, a small shift in focus and a realization from certain groups that actually we've got a low-hanging fruit here that we could have a major impact on. And when I talk about major impact, as I said, for our scenario here, we've got that vessel entering the Kilvan Cull. It's now blocking the port completely. It's pretty well and truly stuck. So it has to go in at low tide for clearances under the Bayonne Bridge at the end. So logic, 6 hours for the next high tide to get as much water under possible to refloat it. We're looking at $180 million worth of value disrupted within the goods. So obviously 6 hours is a tight turnaround. Obviously New York do have the facilities there and capability to deal with the situation. So 2 and a bit days potentially to move it is $1.6 billion of value disruption. The problem is that when we presented this with New York and spoke to the port there, some were sort of saying 5 to 7 days potentially to clear that. And, at that point in time, we're looking at 1.5% of global trade value being disrupted. One port, one vessel, and one relatively simple attack when we start looking at it. And for us, that's a real concern, is that it doesn't take potentially a targeted attack here to do that. You just need a piece of software that's got relatively long lines of GPS coordinates with that could be numerous different channels, port entrances around the world. And when any ship sails in that happens to be having this software installed, it triggers. It's a relatively low-hanging fruit, and obviously for us, that's a bit of an area of concern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it over to Ishmael now, who's going to sort of go through some of the sort of threat intelligence stuff that sort of feeds into this.
Thank you so much, Rory. And, I would love at this point to have a conversation, right? The three of us, Dr. Rory Hopcraft and, Corey as well, Ransom, so we can talk about, is this really possible? And how can maybe traditional cyber threat intelligence that is focused on IT to help in this type of scenarios? Because I think that maybe especially before this disaster happened in Baltimore, this was not something that was really discussed a lot around the cybersecurity community. But we have definitely seen a lot of scenarios that are similar to these ones, and and we're gonna kind of look at how we can leverage this type of intelligence, right, to help in this type of situations. This is really at the core of what we do, right? I represent the threat research and intelligence team at BlackBerry, and when I talk about what we do, I like to refer to this mission, cyber resiliency. What is cyber resiliency? Well, it's the ability not just to prevent all bad things from happening, because let's be realistic, that's not possible, right? And I usually say you cannot defend all of your assets, you cannot defend against all of the threats, you have to prioritize. And this is really the goal of this, right? It's to be able to anticipate what are the threats that can cause an impact in your organization, be able to defend against them, and defending here means to withstand and to recover, right, and to adapt to all of these incidents, all of these attacks that we're going to have no matter what. So this is not about preventing these attacks from happening, right? It's about defending against these attacks. So why do we do this? Because we want to be resilient. We want to continue operating in our businesses. And these businesses, as we just saw, depend on cyber security assets or resources, and even these cargo ships, right? As we can see, they have connectivity, and whether it's through a USB device or email or combination of both, there is a vector there that we need to protect. So that's what BlackBerry Silence is focused on, and together with partners like Dryad, right? That's what we do. I know, Corey, you probably talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the webinar. But let's talk about what's the benefit of cyber threat intelligence. One of the questions I was asking myself when I was looking at these simulations that they're doing at the University of Plymouth that Rory presented, I was thinking about, is this really realistic? Can this really happen? And you may be thinking, well, it hasn't happened before, right? Or we may think that this is not realistic because, again, it's not happened before. But we know that attackers are focused on impact, and we have seen very similar scenarios across the world. I mean, maybe you can, if you know any others, Rory and Corey, feel free to chime in. But I was thinking immediately about, for example, the Colonial Pipeline attack here in the U.S. We saw how that resulted in some unexpected events, like gas stations closing down, right, and saying we're out of order, and then that had a cascading effect, even in this area, right? When you were talking about the port of New York, I live here in the New Jersey, New York area, and I could really envision what you were saying and the huge impact that would have, or airlines not being able to operate and canceling flights because of a ransomware attack. That's happened before, right? SpiceJet out of India. We usually focus here on what's happening here in the US, but there's a lot of these events happening in other areas of the world as well. Power outages, right? Because of threat actors targeting this infrastructure. We have seen this in Ukraine years before, right? We continue to see this in other regions in the world. Or water plants being hacked. Again, that has a huge impact. We consider this critical infrastructure. But you may have not thought, or maybe that's something I haven't put a lot of thought in before, in cargo ships being hacked, or yachts or cruises, as you said before, Corey. Is there any other type of examples that come to your mind that might be closer to that scenario that you discussed before, Rory?
I mean, for me, the closest we've come in the sector really probably is the NotPetya from a few years ago. Obviously, wasn't targeting maritime, but showed sort of the fragility of the system that because of the interconnectivity, when one system gets hit, it could potentially spread quite rapidly. Not just into the transport sectors, but across all sectors.
All sectors.
Well,
that's a very good example.
It's also interesting too, if you look at from the large yacht industry. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, MarineMax made a disclosure here in the United States that they were a victim of a cyber attack, and we've seen it in a number of other large yacht management companies. And when you look at the relationship between the management company and the yacht, there's a lot of communication that's going back and forth between those. So just like the example that Rory brought, the Maersk example, you could see potentially the same thing as a cascading effect with a yacht management company, but you can also broaden that into ship management or cruise line management. As you look today, there's so much more data going between vessels, whether they're cargo, cruise, or large yachts, and their shoreside management than we've seen before. And there's also a number of legacy systems on board some of these vessels that you still have to protect. So I think the number of examples is pretty prevalent in the maritime industry. And to your point, Ishmael, I think we're going to see that continue. And I know the title of this was an attack in the Red Sea, and we've already seen in some cases the attempts in different areas in the world of a cyber attack playing out in front of an actual physical attack. So the dynamic and the vectors are going to continue to change, and I think improve over the coming months and years.
That's very interesting, the point that you bring, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what cyber threat intelligence is about, or what threat intelligence in general is about, not just cyber, but physical as well. It's about knowing the motivation, knowing the why. And that has to do a lot with geopolitics, right? For example, what's happening in around the Red Sea is very particular to that region, what happens in the Middle East. And I'm pretty sure that what you see from a physical perspective what's happening in that area corresponds to what we see in the cyber world with different players that are, playing there, including Russia, Iran, China, and how it kind of like mimics, right, or mirrors this threat landscape. What I usually say is that cyber threat intelligence should help decision makers to make good decisions, right, based on that analysis of the data, turning that data, raw data, into intelligence. So it can help them to, we talk about anticipating, right, anticipating what the attacker could do, what the impact could be, even identifying or prioritizing what are the assets at risk. What is that I need to prioritize today? As we're going to see later, there's so many vulnerabilities that we have to look at, or we should be looking at on a daily basis, that it's overwhelming. It's unbearable. We have to go to the threats and use that to prioritize somehow what we need to do, so we can protect those assets at risk, so we can have visibility, right? Even from a telemetry perspective, for that particular threat actor, that particular vector that we discussed before on a vessel, on a ship, like USB devices, how can we track that, right? Do we have the proper visibility? We need visibility to be able to hunt for indicators of an attack, to know if we have been attacked before or if we're being attacked today, right? To be able to detect early indications of an attack. A lot of people is focused on stopping the ransomware payloads, talking about ransomware here. But the reality is, before the ransomware hits the system, there's a number of indicators of an attack, or early indications on that attack, in that attack chain, that we can focus on, that will give us an advantage, right? Because we want to disrupt that as soon as possible. Essentially, the ability to investigate and contextualize, like, why is this happening? Who can this correspond to in terms of like threat actors? And you need all of that information to be able to respond effectively. It's not the same thing to respond to, common Trojans that we see in the financial world, and responding to a ransomware attack, especially in critical infrastructure. Whole different game. So, I'm more on the cyber intelligence world, but I know, Corey, you guys have been working for a long time with this type of customers in the maritime industry, not just with cyber intelligence, but also with physical threat intelligence. What type of information do you guys provide, and what do you see? What trends do you see there?
Sure, and that's a great question. Dryad was originally started to provide that maritime domain intelligence and information, that full and complete picture of what is happening in the maritime space to our clients globally. And that always has centered around the geopolitics, the physical side, the security side of it. Can we make this route transit? Can we get in and out of this port? What are the potential issues within a certain country or region? But over the last few months, we've started to see cyber slowly make its way into those intelligence reports. And that's one thing that our teams have been very keen on, is looking at the potential of a cyber attack on a potential vessel in a particular port or in a particular region, or maybe because of a particular ownership or management. Again, regardless of whether it's a cruise line, cargo, or large yacht, we think that the attacks are going to become more directed in the maritime industry in the future. And to your point, one of the reasons that we like our partnership and it's expanding with BlackBerry and Plymouth University is to be able to test these theories. As we see things out in the industry, we can take that to Plymouth, and Rory and his team can then run simulations to see what is the potential for this to take place. Because to your point, Ishmael, we need to know or get as much information on what those attack surfaces look like as quickly as possible, so then that we can get that information out to our clients in the global maritime industry about what those attack vectors look like and what's taking place. So then we can, again, continue to improve the protection that we're providing. So the intelligence, I think, is something that's always evolving, and we'll have another seminar probably on this very same topic a year from now, and I'll be willing to bet what we're going to talk about a year from now is going to be very different from today, as we're just starting to see artificial intelligence become part of that. Right now, we're still seeing in the maritime industry of ransomware and malware attacks, and man in the middle are fairly common. But I think we're going to start to see that dynamic in the coming months and years really start to change.
Very interesting. Even deep fakes, right? You were talking about communications between, different actors, the vessel, right? Maybe some other command center. And deepfakes could be used as well to as part of these attack chains. So that makes a lot of sense, right? You cannot separate the physical threat intelligence from the cyber threat intelligence. At the end of the day, it's all about security outcomes, right? If I want to move a cargo from in a vessel from the Mediterranean to Asia, I will have to go through the Red Sea, right? Most likely, I guess. So, I need to know what's happening.
I mean, what a lot of traffic is doing right now, but going around the Horn of Africa. Yep.
But you would need to know what's happening, right, in these regions. What could be could it get the cargo ship hijacked, right, by some pirates operating in the out of the Red Sea, for example. And you need to know what are the cyber threats that are happening. So that's our goal, and that's what we do, for example, with the Global Threat Intelligence Report. I'm just going to go through some of the highlights on what we see around the world based on the telemetry that we received from our sensors that we have deployed across our customers in all the regions of the world. We're talking about our BlackBerry Silence suite, endpoint security. And on a quarterly basis, we report on the trends, right? Sometimes people get really fixated in the numbers, and the numbers are interesting, of course, but I'm more interested in the trends. And one of the trends that we see here clearly, it's an increase in the unique pieces of malware that attackers are using. What is this in layman terms, right? It's a fingerprint. We talk about unique hashes or unique fingerprints for these pieces of malware. So unique pieces of malware used in an attack indicates targeting, indicates that attackers are trying to bypass traditional security defenses. And if you look at the trend over a year, we went from 1.5 unique pieces of malware being used per minute against our customer base to 3.7. So this grew exponentially. This indicates automation from the part of the attackers, not necessarily always AI, right? Let's demystify this. There's a lot of hype around AI all over the place. Everybody thinking about the chat GPTs, the LLMs, which are great tools to assist you, right? They're not going to replace you. A friend of mine said yesterday something that I really loved. AI is not going to take your job. Somebody using AI will probably take your job, right? Attackers are using AI in the same way, right? They're using this as a tool, and as many of the tools that we have. But as we're going to see later, attackers, they continue to rely on well-known tools, well-known weapons, because they're effective, and because in many cases, organizations, they don't have the right defenses in place. Is that what you see, Corey, in the maritime industry? What do those networks look like?
And that's an interesting question. I was almost going to throw this over to Rory as well, but you see very different networks design and configuration based on the operation of the vessel. So a network on a large yacht and how they have their network set up is going to be a little bit different than a cargo ship, and completely different than a cruise ship. And then how that communication link from ship to shore happens, and the security or non-security of that. I've said in a number of public forums and domains that I feel that the maritime industry is probably 10 or 15 years behind the rest of the world when it comes to just recognizing the problem of cybersecurity and recognizing that there is the potential for attacks, even though if you do a quick search through Google, through the news globally, you can see there have been a number of attacks on critical maritime infrastructure around the world. So the attacks are continuing. We expect them to increase. And it's interesting because we've seen the U.S. Coast Guard here in the United States has put out a notice of proposed rulemaking where there's going to be changes to requirements for reporting and a number of other things for regulated facilities and vessels here in the United States. We obviously have the requirements that were put out by IMO 2021, but talking to people across the board in that regulatory environment, I would expect that the regulations are going to continue to increase as governments around the world look at the critical infrastructure. We just saw that the Port of Miami found modems in their port container cranes that they bought 10 years ago from China that was sending data back. So there's a number of things that it's almost becoming a daily occurrence in the news media, whether you look at the cruise, the large yacht, or the cargo industry, of threats and things that are taking place within our industry.
And I think there's also a couple of big issues as well. Corey, as you said, they bought those cranes 10 years ago and found modems that were vulnerable in those. It's not just port infrastructure. You think a vessel is 5 to 7 years from initial conception to the keel hitting the water. The systems are designed at day one because we're now doing secure by design, 7 years out of date before they even hit the water, 25, 30 years worth of life expectancy from a vessel. You've got 30, 40-year-old systems. And, yes, we've got the legacy problem now. We're still going to have that legacy problem in the future. Right. And I think the second point I wanted to say here was also, talking about the networks and the differences in them. We used to have this world where we had sister ships. Whereas now we don't, because yes, the systems might be integrated and set up exactly the same, but the minute a crew take over command of that vessel, they may patch differently. That one system may be updated, one system might not be. Somebody will bring a device on that brings something with it. Somebody will plug this into the network. They'll have a different charter on board who's plugged this device in. As soon as they're out in operation, those networks look completely different, even though they were designed to be identical. We've spoken to people where they think they've got an air gap, and then they've gone on to do an inspection and found that somebody has plugged an Ethernet cable between the master's computer and the ECDIS, and you suddenly think, well, they were secure, 6 months ago when we did the last inspection, but now, that one Ethernet cable breaks their security assumption.
Air gapped, yeah. If I had, $1 every time I heard that, oh yeah, don't worry, no need to audit this, it's air gapped. Yes, sure. Right. Just very briefly, I'm going to share some high level statistics here on what we see. Again, like confirming what we discussed before, it's all about the geopolitics. So for example, we see a lot of interesting activity in Asia Pacific. South Korea, Japan, and the United States have now come to an agreement to defend against attacks coming from North Korea, China. These are the actors that are very active, right, in that region, along with Russia, and Iran. But they're also very active. Some of them are very active in the Middle East, right? And we see the same actors now, playing a role in these regions. Very interesting. We see the majority of the attacks happening in what we call critical infrastructure, right? 62% of these attacks against critical infrastructure, especially with unique malware, right, or unique hashes, which again, it's a sign of targeting. Like they're targeting these type of organizations, and we define critical infrastructure here as CISA, the cybersecurity agency in the U.S. Defines it. So that includes finance, healthcare, government, public sector, food and agriculture, and utilities, right, and others, including maritime transportation. I think you had a good point before, right, Rory? We were talking about this. We were chatting a little bit, and you were thinking about, what this really means for maritime.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we've come across a few times, is that while manufacturers aren't necessarily themselves a piece of critical infrastructure, we have such few providers for some of the critical systems within the sector, particularly around the control systems, engine, etc., that actually they are almost an integral part of that critical infrastructure, so need to be considered part of it as well. We have seen numerous CVEs looking at PLCs, vulnerabilities in PLCs. Those PLCs are used in lots of different critical infrastructure settings, maritime just being one of them. So when you're talking about, threat intelligence and staying in front of those security risks, it's almost, well, actually, we need to be keeping an eye on those CVEs, and working out, well, actually, if we've got those PLCs that they're affecting, we're now at risk as well. And we haven't got that. We've got that divide at the moment.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I actually highlighted this slide, right, with CVEs, like just within this reporting period, which in this case, it took 4 months, September to December 2023, we had more than 10,000 CVEs published by NIST. 16%, right? 1,600 with a score of 9 or above, or critical. It's insane, right? It's overwhelming. You cannot just like look at vulnerabilities as the main thing to be secure. You have to look at the threats to prioritize. Corey, I think you have
one of the things I wanted to jump in, and I think we can potentially maybe even start to transition to the Q&A because we've got a few dropping into the box. There was a comment made that I think rings very true to our industry, was that this participant commented that they believe that there's probably already been attacks and test runs that have been carried out against vessels, against port, against companies within the industry. But the problem that presents is the reporting of those back into the industry. And we've seen that across maritime, whether it's the large yacht side, the cargo, or the cruise, where we've been on board vessels and we know that, hey, this vessel was the victim of a cyber attack, but there's no reporting of that back into the industry. Whereas you see, again, within the healthcare sector, within the financial sector, that the reporting of attacks is pretty wide open. And I think that's one of the things that the Coast Guard regulations are really trying to address, or their notice of proposed rulemaking change, is that reporting of that, because we all benefit from that if we understand what that attack vector was, instead of just reporting, hey, our company or our vessel or whatever was the victim of a cyber attack. But then we don't have any details as an industry. We can't work with Plymouth to run simulations to look at the intelligence out there of the prevalence of this type of an attack vector. So hopefully that starts to change. And one of the things that we're doing with some of our clients is looking at the potential threats and vectors that we're seeing, and then, anonymously working with you guys at BlackBerry and your team, Rory, at Plymouth, to be able to share that back to say, hey, could this potential vector, or something maybe we haven't seen or haven't thought of, could this be an actual attack vector? So I thought that was a really interesting comment and a problem that we see that I think is very prevalent within the industry.
Excellent.
And I think part of what the sector has done. Oh, sorry, Ishmael. I was just going to say, part of what the sector's done for years is looking to insurance companies to give some of that information on where the losses have occurred, so that then we learn from those. But the problem is obviously with cyber, we still have the exclusion clause. There's still limited coverage for cyber incidents, so we don't see the reporting. I know the comment was saying about reputation and things like that being damaged, but it's also the loss because of the insurance not paying out if it's known to be a cyber attack. So that is a real issue with that reporting in the long run.
One of the other questions that I wanted to jump into that I thought was really interesting, and I know we're limited on time, so we have a number of questions coming in, but if we don't get to all of the questions during the Q&A period, one of us, between Ishmael, Rory, or myself, will make sure that we respond back to your questions, so we'll be able to get through these, whether it's part of the presentation or offline. But there was one question that said, hey, would we expect more state or non-state actors like pirates to use cyber attacks on shipping in the coming years? And my answer to this would be absolutely yes. I would see that we're going to see the prevalence of potential cyber attacks against vessels potentially be the precursor to an actual physical attack. It makes it much easier if I can completely disable a ship and it has no maneuvering capabilities for a pirate team to then be able to get on board. So, but I'm interested, Rory and Ishmael, kind of what your opinion is on that.
I totally agree. I think we're going to see a far more... Oh, sorry, Ishmael.
No, I was going to say that, attackers are focused on impact once again, right? And if it's cyber criminals, they're going to be interested in just monetizing anything. So if it's if it's a cargo ship that can be prevented from getting to shore, right, and delivering those goods. That obviously, Rory, you were talking about money right before an impact. That's what they're going to be focusing on. So the easier attackers are always lazy. They're just going to try to pull off whatever has a highest return on investment.
Yeah, and I was going to agree with that. We've seen pirates using AIS to track high target, high value bounty. So it's just a natural progression. We're seeing terrorist groups employing cyber experts to develop their own capabilities. So it is natural growth.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how this is evolving. And like I said, in a year, we'll do this April 2nd of 2025. We'll do this again, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of follow up to this. Another question I wanted to jump on: are vessels specifically targeted with cybersecurity attacks, or is it more of a case of any vessel entering a specific area which will be attacked? I'm interested to get your thoughts on that, Rory, from the perspective of, is it really any vessel or in a certain area?
So currently what we see is areas more than anything, with the GPS spoofing around the Black Sea, the Straits of Hormuz, it's very much targeted at areas rather than individual vessels. But, well, and again, I think the other side of that is also true. I think even like the specific scenario of the New York that we presented here isn't specifically targeting a vessel going into New York. It's going to be spread out to 1,000 vessels. If they can get that software running on 1,000 vessels, well, it doesn't matter which one of those 1,000 enter New York and triggers, they will have that impact. So I think it is very much sort of wide focused in an area rather than I'm going to target your particular vessel, because taking one vessel out doesn't have an impact. The scenarios we've seen, from, the tragedy at Baltimore, the Suez Canal a couple of years ago, Non-Petya, targeting single communal spaces, the choke points, are the bits that, are what gets the impact.
Yeah. What?
Is it all right if I chuck an answer to one of the questions as well, Corey, before we run out?
Yeah, jump in.
Lots of questions.
There's a couple that, yeah, there's loads. There's a couple sort of talking about training, and there was one about the military, whether this kind of scenario could happen to military vessels. So yes, in theory they could, but there's one thing I wanted to pick up on that. So when we presented this to military, whereas a normal container vessel, they wouldn't necessarily have somebody manning the manual override stations straight away. On military vessels, they do. So their response time is significantly reduced, which is to benefit to all. But that brings us back round to the main point about some people have sort of mentioned training in there, is that technology is only one part of the solution to cyber. Training is the other part. Yes, right. Ishmael was talking about being able to detect things early enough, responding well, making good decisions. That is all skills that we need to learn, and potentially change procedure to match those. Like, if we're going into narrow waters with shallow draft, we need to make sure that we've got somebody manning the manual overrides. Might reduce the response time by 30, 40 seconds, but that could make a huge difference.
And I can attest to that. The 8 years I spent in the U.S. Coast Guard, when I first got in, my job was to sit in aft steering in case we had a steering failure, that I could manually, by command, turn the rudder outside of the electronic system. So I know in that respect, the military is different. But to your point, Rory, that 30 or 40 seconds, when you look at that simulation that you ran, was 2.5 minutes. And you could really take that to any vessel in any narrow channel or port, and see the results of that can really make a huge difference. One of the things that I think the crew training is really a big piece that I don't think there's enough resources out there to help the crew from a training perspective to be able to understand this. But I also think that one of the things that we've looked at and tried to do is really to look at what's kind of the first line of protection. Well, number one is to understand, how your systems are designed and set up on board the ship and where those vulnerabilities are. And that is usually fairly easy and cost effective to do. In most cases can be done remotely. And the second thing is our first line of protection that we recommend to our clients is putting protection on the actual endpoints, on the computers, on the iPads, on the servers, on the systems that are running on board the vessel. That's the user machine interface to be able to quarantine and stop some of that malware before it spreads into the rest of the system. So, and I know there was a couple of questions kind of along those lines, but that's one of the things we recommend is understand on board your vessels what your IT and cyber footprint looks like, and then be able to design based on that footprint and where your potential vulnerabilities are.
And also something else that we have discussed before, Corey, as well, is that we have the particular use case that a lot of these ships, they're going to be disconnected off the internet for a long time, right? So these things have to run offline. They cannot be connected all the time to the internet, sending a lot of data out to the cloud and downloading a lot of data. Like that may work in some like IT environments, but it doesn't really work
it doesn't work on the ship
in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah. Well, in a slight little commercial, that's why as Dryad, we're working with you guys at BlackBerry on those solutions specifically that will work in those low and no bandwidth environments when you're talking about vessels. So unfortunately, we didn't get to all the questions, but I know we're kind of at the end of the webinar, and I'll toss it back over to you, Felicia.
Yeah, we can continue the conversation maybe on social media as well, right? Maybe on LinkedIn and X or Twitter. Like, happy to do that.
Yep.
Absolutely. Wonderful to keep the conversation going. Well, thank you, Corey, Ismail, and Rory. I'd like to thank our wonderful audience and speakers for your participation in today's webinar. As a reminder, if we missed your question, we will follow up with you after the session. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on demand shortly after the conclusion. We encourage you to share it with your team. Resources from today's webinar, including the on-demand recording, will be emailed to you. Looking for the latest cybersecurity insights? Visit blackberry.com/events for updates on upcoming and on-demand webinars from our cybersecurity experts. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you and good day.